The autumn wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and desperation. Samuel Carson stood at the back of the crowded town hall, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his worn leather coat. At 42, he'd learned to keep his distance from people, from hope, from anything that might crack the armor he'd built around his heart. But today, something had drawn him here. Something he couldn't name. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp and callous. "And now, gentlemen, we have a special item. A young woman, approximately 20 years of age, abandoned by her family, no means of support. Perfect for a wife, a housekeeper, or whatever your needs might be." Samuel's jaw clenched. The practice turned his stomach, but it was legal in these parts. Desperate families sold their daughters to settle debts. Orphans were auctioned to the highest bidder. The frontier was cruel, especially to women alone. A figure was led onto the platform, small and trembling beneath a heavy black veil that covered her completely. She wore a simple grey dress that hung loosely on her frame, as if she'd lost weight recently. Her hands were bound, not with rope but with shame. "She comes with nothing," the auctioneer continued. "No dowry, no family name, but she's young and she can work. Shall we start the bidding at $50? Samuel watched as several men raised their hands. He recognized them. Jack Morrison, who'd buried 3 wives already, each one worked to death on his failing ranch. Pete Sullivan, whose eyes gleamed with something dark and hungry. Old Tom Wheeler, who needed a nursemaid for his invalid wife but wouldn't pay fair wages. None of them would treat her right. None of them would see her as anything more than property. 75, Morrison called out. 80, Sullivan countered, his voice oily with anticipation. The woman on the platform swayed slightly, as if she might faint. Through the veil, Samuel could see nothing of her face, but he could read her terror in every line of her body. 100, Wheeler shouted. Samuel's hands curled into fists. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. He had no business getting involved. His ranch was a day's ride from town, isolated in the shadow of the mountains. He'd chosen that isolation deliberately after the war, after everything he'd lost. He didn't need complications, but he couldn't walk away. 125, Morrison said, grinning. $500. The words came from Samuel's mouth before he'd fully decided to speak them. The room fell silent. Every head turned to look at him. The auctioneer's eyes widened. "Did you say 500, Mr. Carson?" "I did." Morrison scowled. "That's more than twice what she's worth." Samuel moved forward through the crowd, his 6'4" frame parting the men like a ship through water. "Then you shouldn't have any trouble letting me win the bid." No one spoke. No one dared. Samuel Carson might keep to himself, but everyone in Copper Creek knew his reputation. War hero. Sharpshooter, a man who'd killed when he had to and never lost sleep over it. "Sold," the auctioneer declared quickly, "to Mr. Carson for $500. Samuel counted out the bills with steady hands, his face showing nothing. Inside, his heart pounded with a mixture of anger at the situation and something else he couldn't identify. When the transaction was complete, the auctioneer gestured toward the woman. "She's all yours. Names on the papers as Grace, no last name given." Grace. Samuel approached the platform slowly, aware that she was trembling harder now. He kept his voice low and gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to take you somewhere safe. Do you understand?" She nodded. "Just barely." "Can you walk?" Another nod. Samuel offered his hand to help her down from the platform. Her fingers were ice cold when they touched his palm, and he could feel how thin she was even through her glove. He steadied her as she stepped down, and she immediately pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. "My wagon's outside," he said. "It's a full day's ride to my ranch. We'll need to leave soon to make it before dark." She followed him. In silence, her steps small and hesitant. The crowd parted, some men watching with disappointment, others with curiosity. Samuel ignored them all. He helped Grace into the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. As they left town, Samuel could feel her tension. She sat as far from him as possible, the veil still covering her face. "You can take that off if you want," he said, after they'd been riding for an hour. "There's no one out here but us." She didn't move. "I'm Samuel Carson," he continued, keeping his eyes on the road. "I have a ranch about 20 miles northwest of town. Cattle and horses mostly. It's just me there. Had a foreman, But he left last spring to get married. Silence. I want you to understand something. Samuel pulled the horses to a stop and turned to face her. I didn't buy you to be a wife or a companion. I bought you because those other men would have treated you badly. You're free to leave whenever you want. I'll pay you fair wages if you want to work as a housekeeper, but you don't owe me anything. Do you understand? For a long moment she didn't respond. Then slowly her hands reached up and lifted the veil. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, but that wasn't what made him stare. It was her eyes. One blue as a summer sky, one green as spring grass. Heterochromia, the doctors called it. He'd seen it once before, in a child back east, but it was more than that. Her face was gaunt, shadows beneath those extraordinary eyes. A fading bruise marked her left cheekbone. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her lips were chapped and pale. And she was looking at him with such raw fear that it nearly broke something inside him. They said I was cursed, she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Because of my eyes. My father said I was marked by the devil, that no decent man would ever want me. Samuel felt rage kindle in his chest. Your father was a fool. She flinched, and he immediately softened his tone. I've seen many terrible things in my life, Grace. War, death, true evil. Your eyes are not cursed. There, he searched for the right word. Extraordinary. A tear slid down her cheek. You don't have to pretend to be kind. I know what I am. I know why I was on that platform. What happened to you? She looked away, toward the mountains in the distance. My mother died 3 years ago. My father remarried. His new wife didn't want me in the house. She said I frightened her children with my devil eyes. He gave me to a family friend to settle a gambling debt. But that man's wife refused to have me, so they brought me to the auction. Her voice cracked. I heard them talking. They said if no one bought me, they'd leave me in the wilderness. Let the wolves have the cursed girl. Samuel's hands clenched on the reins. He wanted to ride back to town and teach those people the true meaning of cursed. But Grace needed him here. Now, look at me, he said gently. She turned those mismatched eyes back to him, and he held her gaze steadily. You are not cursed. You are not marked by anything except perhaps bad luck in your family. And you will never be abandoned again. I swear it. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why would you do this for a stranger? Samuel was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. Because 5 years ago, I came back from the war to find my wife and daughter dead from fever. I wasn't there to help them. I wasn't there to hold them while they died, and I swore that if I ever had the chance to protect someone who needed it, I would. Grace's expression shifted, some of the fear fading into something softer. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for yours. He gently flicked the reins, and the wagon started moving again. Now, let's get you home and fed. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in months. I haven't, she admitted. They only gave me enough to keep me alive for the auction. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Well, I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage beef stew and biscuits, and there's plenty of it. For the first time, he saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips. They rode in silence for a while, but it was a different kind of silence now, less fearful, more contemplative. Samuel found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, the way she shivered when the wind picked up, the way she studied the landscape with curious eyes. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting the plains in gold and amber, Samuel pointed ahead. There, that's home. The ranch sat in a valley between 2 low hills, protected from the worst of the winter winds. The main house was built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees. It's beautiful, Grace said softly. It's isolated, Samuel replied. Nearest neighbor is 10 miles south. Town is a full day's ride. Gets lonely sometimes. I've been lonely my whole life, she said. At least here, the loneliness comes with a view. He glanced at her, surprised by the dry humor in her tone. There was strength in this woman, buried under the fear and trauma. He found himself wanting to know her, to understand what else lay hidden beneath the surface. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, and this time she didn't pull away quite so quickly. He showed her into the house, lighting lamps as the dusk settled around them. The interior was simple but well-maintained. A large main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, a table and chairs. 2 doors led to bedrooms at the back. "I'll take the smaller room," Samuel said. "You can have the main bedroom. It has a lock on the inside of the door. You can use it whenever you want." Grace looked at him with those extraordinary eyes, searching his face for deception or ulterior motives. She wouldn't find any. "Thank you," she said finally. I don't know how to repay you." "There's nothing to repay. Now sit down and I'll get that stew started." As Samuel worked in the kitchen, he was hyper-aware of Grace watching him from the table. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, as if afraid to take up too much space. "You can look around if you want," he said. "This is your home now, too." "Is it?" she asked quietly. "Or will you change your mind when you realize what a burden I am?" Samuel stopped stirring the pot and turned to face her. "Grace, I spent 3 years in the war. I saw men at their worst and their best. I learned to judge character pretty quickly because it meant the difference between life and death. You are not a burden. You're a woman who deserved better than what life gave her. And I'm a man who has more space and resources than he needs. This arrangement benefits us both. How does it benefit you?" He considered the question. "This house has been quiet for too long. Sometimes the silence is harder than the loneliness. And honestly, I could use help. Around here. The cooking, the mending, the garden I can't seem to keep alive. If you're willing to do those things, I'd be grateful. But even if you're not, you're still welcome here." Grace stood and walked slowly to the kitchen area. "May I help?" "Can you cook better than I can?" "I don't know how good you are." Samuel grinned, the expression feeling strange on his face after so long. "Let's just say my biscuits could double as ammunition if we run out of bullets." The smallest laugh escaped her lips, and the sound hit Samuel like a physical thing. When was the last time he'd made someone laugh? They worked together in the kitchen, and Samuel noticed how Grace's hands moved with practiced efficiency, even though she was learning his kitchen. She'd been trained well, despite how her family had treated her. Over dinner, he learned more about her. She was 19, nearly 20. She could read and write, which was unusual for women in these parts. Her mother had insisted on educating her, despite her father's objections. "Mama said that my eyes made me different, so I had to be better in other ways," Grace explained, her voice soft. "She taught me numbers and letters, cooking and sewing. She said that knowledge was something no one could take from me." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. I miss her every day." Grace looked down at her plate. Do you miss your wife?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I miss the idea of what we could have been. The truth is, our marriage was arranged. We were fond of each other, but we married young before we really knew each other. My daughter, though," his voice roughened, "Sarah was 4 years old, full of life and questions and laughter. Losing her nearly destroyed me." Grace reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated contact, and the gesture moved him more than he wanted to admit. "I think," she said gently, "that Sarah would be glad you're helping someone. Children understand kindness better than adults do." Samuel had to look away, blinking against the sudden burning in his eyes. "I think you're right." That night, Samuel lay in his bed in the small room and listened to the sounds of Grace moving around in the main bedroom. He heard the scrape of the lock as she secured the door, and he didn't blame her one bit. He stared at the ceiling, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd meant every word he said. She could leave whenever she wanted, and he wouldn't force her into anything. But the truth he hadn't told her was that the moment he'd seen her face, something had shifted inside him. 5 years of numbness, of just going through the motions of living, and suddenly he felt awake again. It terrified him. The next morning, Samuel woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. He dressed quickly and emerged from his room to find Grace already at the stove, her dark hair braided down her back, wearing the same grey dress, but with an apron over it. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. She turned, and he saw that some colour had returned to her cheeks. "Good morning. I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd make breakfast." "Mind? I'm grateful. That's the best smell I've woken up to in years." They ate together, and Samuel outlined his day. "I need to check the cattle in the north pasture, make sure none of them got through the fence. It'll take most of the day. You're welcome to come with me, or you can stay here. The choice is yours." "I'd like to come," Grace said, surprising him, "if that's all right. I've never seen a real ranch operation." "Of course it's all right." Samuel saddled 2 horses, choosing the gentlest mare for Grace. He showed her how to mount, steadying her with his hands on her waist. Even through the layers of fabric, he could feel how delicate she was, and something protective rose in his chest. As they rode out across the ranch, Samuel pointed out landmarks and explained his operation. He had 200 head of cattle and about 30 horses. In the summer, he hired temporary hands for the branding and drives, but he managed alone the rest of the year. "Doesn't it get too much for one man?" Grace asked. "Sometimes, but I prefer it to having people around all the time. After the war, I needed space, quiet, time to heal." "Did you? Heal, I mean?" Samuel considered the question as they rode along the creek. "I learned to live with it. That's not the same as healing, but it's something." They reached the north pasture, and Samuel was pleased to see the fence intact and the cattle grazing peacefully. As he did a final check, he noticed Grace had dismounted and was standing by the creek, her hand resting on a cottonwood tree. He approached quietly. "You all right? I never imagined places like this existed," she said without turning. "Where I grew up, everything was cramped and dirty. The city was all smoke and noise. She gestured at the landscape. "This is like a dream." "It's real," Samuel said, moving to stand beside her. "And it's yours to enjoy for as long as you want." Grace turned to look at him, and in the bright sunlight, her eyes were even more striking, blue and green, like sky meeting earth. "Why do you keep saying things like that?" she asked. "That I can stay, that I can leave, that I have choices. I've never had choices before." "Maybe it's time you did." She studied his face, and Samuel forced himself to stand still under her scrutiny. He knew what she'd see. A weathered man, with more grey in his dark hair than brown, lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, a scar on his jaw from a Confederate bayonet. He wasn't handsome, and he'd never been smooth with words, but whatever Grace saw, it seemed to satisfy her. She nodded slowly. "I'd like to stay, for a while at least. If you'll teach me about the ranch, I'll teach you whatever you want to know." Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Grace transformed the house, bringing order and warmth to spaces that had been merely functional. She cooked meals that made Samuel realize he'd been barely surviving on what he'd been eating before. She mended his clothes, tended a late-season garden, and even started making curtains from fabric he bought in town. But more than that, she asked questions. About the cattle, the horses, the land. She wanted to learn everything, and Samuel found himself enjoying the role of teacher. He taught her to ride properly, and she proved to be a natural horsewoman, despite her initial nervousness. He showed her how to rope a fence post, how to read weather signs in the clouds, how to move cattle without spooking them. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of fence, Grace paused and looked at him with those extraordinary eyes. "Can I ask you something personal?" Samuel hammered in another nail. "Sure. Do you ever think about marrying again? Having a family?" The question caught him off guard. He set down the hammer and faced her. "I used to think I was done with all that I'd had my chance and lost it. And now?" "Now, I don't know." "Why do you ask?" Grace's cheeks flushed pink. "Some of the men in town, when we went for supplies last week, they asked me if you were courting me, if we were together." Samuel felt his own face heat. "What did you tell them? That you've been nothing but a gentleman? That you gave me a job and a safe place to live?" "But they didn't seem to believe me." She twisted her hands together. "They said a man doesn't buy a woman at auction unless he wants her for himself." Anger flared in Samuel's chest. "Who said that?" "It doesn't matter. I wanted to know if it's true, if you expect something from me eventually." Samuel moved closer, then stopped, giving her space. "Grace, look at me." She lifted those mismatched eyes to his. "I meant what I said that first day. You don't owe me anything. Not now, not ever. If I wanted a wife, I'd have courted someone properly, not bought her at an auction like a piece of property." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Those men in town don't understand because they can't imagine treating a woman with simple human decency." "So you don't want me?" The in question, asked so quietly, made Samuel's heart ache. "I didn't say that." Grace's eyes widened. "I said you don't owe me anything," Samuel continued carefully. "That's different from not wanting you. You're a beautiful, intelligent, capable woman, Grace. Any man would be lucky to have you choose him, but it has to be your choice. Do you understand? Your choice, made freely, without obligation or fear." She took a step closer to him, then another. Samuel held himself very still, barely breathing. "What if I wanted to choose you?" she whispered. "Then I'd ask if you're sure, if you're not just grateful, or scared, or feeling obligated despite what I said." "I am grateful," Grace admitted, "but it's more than that. You make me feel safe. You make me laugh. You treat me like I matter, like my thoughts and feelings are important. I've never had that before." Samuel reached out slowly and cupped her face with one calloused hand, his thumb gently tracing the fading bruise on her cheek. "You do matter. You always have, even when the people around you were too foolish to see it." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Samuel, we should take this slow," he said, though it nearly killed him. "You've been through a lot. I don't want you to make a decision you'll regret." "I won't regret it." She opened her eyes and looked at him with such certainty that it took his breath away. "I've never been more sure of anything." Samuel bent his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she didn't. She rose up on her toes to meet him, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle, tentative, filled with promise rather than passion. Samuel kept his hands carefully placed, one on her face, one on her shoulder, resisting the urge to pull her closer. This had to be at her pace, on her terms. When they finally pulled apart, Grace was smiling. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her. Face from merely pretty to absolutely radiant. "That was my first kiss," she said. Her cheeks flushed. "Then I'm honored it was with me." They stood there in the autumn sunshine, Grace's hand resting over Samuel's heart, both of them grinning like fools. The fence could wait. Everything could wait. But that evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel forced himself to address the elephant in the room. "Grace, if we're going to pursue this, pursue us, we need to do it right. I want to court you properly. I want you to be absolutely certain that this is what you want, and I want the whole town to know that you're not just my housekeeper or some woman I bought. You're the woman I'm courting with the intention of marriage, if you'll have me." Marriage. Grace's voice was breathless. "Eventually, when you're ready. If you're ready, no pressure, no timeline, just eventually." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky. "My whole life, people have made decisions for me. Where I lived, what I wore, who I could talk to. My father chose to give me away. That man chose to auction me off. And then you chose to save me." Samuel waited, his heart pounding. "But this," Grace continued, turning to look at him with those extraordinary eyes, "this is the first choice that's truly mine. And I choose you, Samuel Carson. I choose this ranch, this life, and I choose to see where this leads. Maybe to marriage, maybe to something else. But whatever it is, it'll be my choice. Our choice." Samuel felt something tight in his chest, loosen for the first time in 5 years. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Our choice," he agreed. As autumn deepened into winter, Samuel and Grace's relationship blossomed in ways that surprised them both. He courted her the old-fashioned way, bringing her wildflowers from the meadow even as they wilted in the first frosts, reading to her by the fireplace in the evenings, from books of poetry and adventure, teaching her to dance in the living room with no music but the crackling of the fire and their own soft humming. Samuel discovered that courting Grace was different from anything he'd experienced before. With his first wife, everything had been proper and predetermined, calling hours, chaperoned visits, formal dinners. But here, isolated on the ranch, they created their own rules. They could spend hours together without judgment, could talk about anything without fear of shocking, delicate sensibilities. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Grace asked him about the war. "Tell me something true," she said, sitting beside him on the worn sofa. "Not the heroic stories people tell, but something real, something you've never told anyone." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "I was afraid every single day," he finally said. "Every morning I woke up wondering if it would be my last. Every night I went to sleep, when I could sleep, and dreamed of the men I'd killed. Everyone talks about bravery and honor and glory, but there was no glory in it, just survival." Grace took his hand, her fingers threading through his. "Thank you for trusting me with that. Do you think less of me for being afraid?" "I think more of you," she said softly. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being terrified. You survived, Samuel. You came home. That took more courage than most people will ever need in their entire lives." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How did you get so wise? Years of being invisible teaches you to watch and listen. I learned more about people by observing than I ever could have by participating." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Grace's head resting on Samuel's shoulder, his arm around her waist. The intimacy of the moment, not physical, but emotional, felt more profound than any kiss. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said eventually. "Anything. When you look at my eyes, what do you see?" Samuel shifted so he could look at her directly. In the firelight, her eyes seemed to glow, blue and green like jewels. "I see uniqueness, strength, beauty. I see you, Grace. Not a curse, not a mark, not anything except the woman I'm falling more in love with every day." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she kissed him with such intensity that it took his breath away. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. I should say goodnight," Samuel said, his voice rough. "Stay," Grace whispered. "Just stay here with me. We don't have to do anything except be together." So they lay together on the sofa, fully clothed, Grace's back against Samuel's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her, and that was how they fell asleep, tangled together in perfect trust. Samuel woke first, just before dawn, and for a moment simply savored the weight of Grace in his arms. She fit against him perfectly, as if she'd been made for this exact space. He could smell the lavender she used in her hair, feel the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. This, he thought, was what he'd been missing. Not just companionship or physical intimacy, but this profound sense of rightness, of home. Grace stirred, turning in his arms to face him. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him watching her, she smiled, sleepy and sweet and completely unguarded. "Morning," she murmured. "Morning." Samuel brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in years." She stretched cat-like, then settled back against him. "I could stay like this forever." "Then let's stay a little longer." They remained there as the sun rose, painting the room in shades of gold and pink, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Grace told him about her mother, the stories she used to tell, the songs she used to sing. Samuel shared memories of his daughter, finding that it hurt less to speak of her with Grace listening. "I think they'd like each other," Grace said. "Your Sarah and my mama, both of them saw the good in people." "I think you're right." Eventually they rose and started the day's work, but something had shifted between them. A new level of intimacy had been reached, and they both felt it. Grace thrived in the coming weeks. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out and her eyes losing that haunted look. She laughed more, talked more, challenged him more. Samuel discovered that beneath her initial shyness was a sharp wit and a stubborn streak that matched his own. She also had opinions, strong ones, about how the ranch should be run. "You're wasting resources on the south pasture," she announced one morning over the breakfast. "The grass is poor there, and you could rotate the cattle to the east meadow where they'd gain weight faster." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And where did you learn about cattle rotation?" "I've been reading those ranch management books in your study. They make a lot of sense." "You've been reading my books. Was I not supposed to?" Grace looked uncertain. "I'm sorry. I thought—" No, Samuel said quickly. "Read whatever you want. I'm just impressed. And you're right about the south pasture. I've been thinking the same thing but haven't had time to reorganize. What if we did it together? I could help." So they did, spending the next week moving cattle and repairing fences in the east meadow. Grace proved to be a natural ranch hand, unafraid of hard work or getting dirty. Samuel found himself watching her more often than he probably should, admiring the way she moved, the determination in her expression, the way the sun caught the colors in her eyes. One afternoon, as they took a break by the creek, Grace caught him staring. "What?" she asked, self-consciously touching her face. "Do I have dirt on my nose again?" "No," Samuel said, moving closer. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am." "Lucky? You've done nothing but work yourself half to death since I got here, and I've enjoyed every minute of it." He took her hand, running his thumb across her knuckles. "Grace, before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions, but you've made me want to live again, to plan for the future, to hope." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You did the same for me. I was ready to die on that auction platform. I'd given up, and then you saved me." "We saved each other," Samuel corrected, pulling her into his arms, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for it." They kissed there by the creek, with the autumn wind swirling leaves around them and the cattle lowing in the distance. And Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in years, complete and utter contentment. They had their first real argument about a horse, and it nearly tore them apart. "I can handle her," Grace insisted, facing down a spirited chestnut mare in the corral. The horse was beautiful, all fire and spirit, with a coat that gleamed like polished copper in the afternoon sun. "You said yourself I'm a good rider now." "Good isn't the same as experienced enough for Wildfire," Samuel countered, his voice harder than he intended. "She's barely broken, Grace. She threw my last foreman and nearly killed him. He had 3 broken ribs and couldn't work for 2 months. Then maybe your foreman wasn't as good a rider as he thought." The dismissive comment sparked something in Samuel, some combination of fear and frustration that he'd been holding back. "This isn't a game, Grace. This isn't about proving yourself or showing you're not fragile. This is about basic safety and common sense." Grace's eyes flashed, blue and green fire. "Don't you dare talk to me like I'm a child." "Then stop acting like one." The words were out before Samuel could stop them, and he saw Grace flinch as if he'd struck her. "A child?" Her voice was dangerously quiet. "I survived 19 years of abuse and neglect. I survived being sold like cattle. I learned to ride in 3 months what takes most people years. But because I want to push myself, want to grow, you treat me like I'm too stupid to make my own decisions. That's not what I meant, isn't it?" Grace's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or hurt. Samuel couldn't tell. "You say I'm not your property, that I have choices, but the first time I choose something you don't like, you tell me no, just like my father. Just like every man who's ever tried to control me." The comparison to her father hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. "Grace, that's not fair." "Fair?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about fair? It's not fair that everyone in my life has told me what I can and can't do. It's not fair that I've never been allowed to take risks or make mistakes or learn for myself. And it's not fair that the one person I thought was different is doing the exact same thing. I'm trying to protect you." "I don't want to be protected," Grace shouted, and in that moment Samuel saw all her pent-up frustration from years of being controlled bubbling to the surface. "I want to live, Samuel, really live, and if that means sometimes I get hurt or make mistakes, then so be it. At least they'll be my mistakes to make." They stared at each other across the corral, both breathing hard, both too angry and hurt to back down. "Fine," Samuel finally said, his voice cold. "Ride her. Break your neck if that's what you want. I can't stop you." He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with anger and fear. Behind him, he heard Grace make a sound that might have been a sob, but he didn't turn around. He couldn't. Samuel made it to the barn before the guilt hit him. He'd handled that all wrong. Grace was right. He'd been trying to control her, just like all the other men in her life. But the thought of her getting hurt, of losing her the way he'd lost Sarah and his wife, terrified him beyond reason. He heard Wildfire whinny, heard Grace's soft voice attempting to soothe the mare, and his heart clenched. What was he supposed to do? Let her risk her life to prove a point, or protect her and risk losing her respect and trust? Samuel stood there for nearly an hour, torn between going back and apologizing and giving Grace the space she clearly wanted. In the end, the decision was made for him. A scream cut through the air, high and terrified, followed by a heavy thud. Samuel's blood turned to ice. He was running before he consciously decided to move, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. "Please," he thought desperately, "please let her be all right." He rounded the corner of the corral and stopped dead. Grace was on the ground, dust covering her dress. Wildfire stood a few feet away, sides heaving, eyes rolling. But Grace was sitting up, which meant she was conscious, which meant, "Are you hurt?" Samuel was at her side in an instant, his hands running over her arms, her legs checking for broken bones or bleeding. "I'm fine," Grace said, but her voice shook. "She bucked me off. I didn't see it coming." "Where does it hurt?" "My pride mostly." Grace tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "And maybe my tailbone." Samuel very gently helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she tested her legs. Nothing seemed broken, thank God, but she was going to be bruised and sore. "I'm sorry." they both said at the same time. Samuel cupped her face. In his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears streaking through the dust on her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Grace. You were right. I was treating you like you couldn't make your own choices, and that was wrong. I was so afraid of losing you. I'm sorry too, Grace whispered. I knew Wildfire wasn't ready. I knew it, but I was so angry, and I wanted to prove you wrong, and I was stupid and reckless. You're not stupid. You're brave and determined and stubborn as hell, and I love you for it. Samuel pressed his forehead against hers. But I can't lose you, Grace. I can't. So maybe we can find a middle ground. You get to make your own choices, take your own risks, but I get to worry about you and try to keep you safe. Grace nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I can live with that. But Samuel, yeah? Next time we argue, can we maybe not let it get so bad? Because that was awful. Samuel laughed shakily. Agreed. Come on, let's get you inside and cleaned up. He helped her to the house, and as he tended to her bruises with gentle hands, he made a silent vow. He would never try to control her again, but he would always try to protect her, even if that meant protecting her from her own stubborn determination sometimes. They compromised. Samuel spent weeks working with both Grace and Wildfire, teaching Grace advanced techniques and gentling the mare further. And when Grace finally rode Wildfire solo for the first time, Samuel's heart was in his throat the entire time. But she did it beautifully, and the pride in her eyes when she brought the mare to a stop in front of him made every moment of worry worth it. I did it, she said, breathless and beaming. You did, Samuel agreed, helping her down. And then, because he couldn't help himself, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly. They were becoming inseparable. Grace often rode out with him to check on the cattle. Samuel helped her in the kitchen, learning her recipes and methods. They talked about everything: her childhood, his war experiences, their hopes for the future. One night, as snow began to fall outside and they sat together by the fire, Grace asked him about his scars. This one, Samuel said, touching the mark on his jaw, was from the Battle of Shiloh. Confederate soldier caught me off guard. My sergeant saved my life. Killed the man who would have finished me off. Grace reached up and traced the scar with gentle fingers. It must have been terrifying. It was. War is nothing but terror, punctuated by brief moments of boredom. He captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. But I survived, came home, eventually found my way here, and eventually found you. Do you think everything happens for a reason? Grace asked. All the terrible things, the losses, the pain. Do you think it leads somewhere? I think we make meaning out of what happens to us, Samuel said thoughtfully. The war didn't happen so I could end up here. My family didn't die for some grand purpose. But I can choose to honor their memory by living well, by being kind, by protecting people who need it, by saving cursed girls at auctions, by recognizing that the only curse was other people's ignorance and cruelty. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and snow whispered against the windows. Samuel, she said after a while, I love you. His heart stopped, then started again with a thunderous beat. He turned to look at her, those mismatched eyes, gazing at him with complete openness and trust. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I think I started loving you the moment you lifted that veil and looked at me with such fear and courage all mixed together. I was terrified, Grace admitted. But then you called my father a fool, and something inside me shifted. No one had ever defended me before. I'll defend you for the rest of my life if you'll let me. Grace sat up and took his face in both her hands. Then I think it's time we talked about marriage. Real talk, not someday talk. Samuel's pulse quickened. Are you sure? We've only been together a few months. I've known you were different from that first day, Grace said, and every day since has only confirmed it. I don't need more time to know that I want to build a life with you. I want to be your wife, Samuel, not because I owe you, not because I'm grateful, but because I love you, and I can't imagine my future without you in it. Samuel kissed her then, deeply, passionately, letting all the love and desire he'd been carefully controlling flow through the touch. Grace responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding into his hair, her body pressing close to his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. Marry me tomorrow. Marry me next spring. I don't care when. Just say you'll be my wife. Yes, Grace whispered. Yes, yes, yes. They decided on a spring wedding, wanting to give Grace time to prepare and to let the whole town see that this was a true courtship. A real love match. Samuel took her to town and bought her fabric for a wedding dress, ignoring the whispers and stares from the people who'd seen her on that auction platform. Grace held her head high, her unique eyes clear and proud. She was no longer the frightened girl in the veil. She was a woman who knew her worth, loved and beloved. Winter was hard that year. A blizzard struck in late December. The worst Samuel had seen in a decade. The first flakes began falling on Christmas Eve, light and innocent, dancing through the air like tiny angels. But within hours, the storm intensified into a howling monster that buried the ranch in white. Samuel had been through Montana winters before. He knew how to prepare, how to stock up on supplies and firewood, how to bring the horses into the barn and ensure the cattle had access to the windbreak. But this storm was different. This storm felt personal, as if nature itself wanted to test them. For 3 days, they were completely cut off from the world. The snow piled so high against the house that Samuel had to dig a path just to reach the barn. The wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the windows and seeping through every crack despite their best efforts to seal them. But inside, by the fire, Samuel couldn't think of anywhere he'd rather be than snowbound with Grace. They passed the time in simple ways, playing cards by lamplight, Grace teaching Samuel a game her mother had shown her, reading aloud to each other, Samuel's voice rough and halting, Grace's smooth and expressive, telling stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. On the second night, as the wind howled its loudest and the walls creaked under the weight of snow and ice, Grace admitted something Samuel had long suspected. "I'm afraid of storms," she said quietly, flinching as thunder cracked overhead, a rare sound in a winter storm, and all the more ominous for it. "When I was little, my father would lock me in the cellar during storms. He said my cursed eyes made the lightning worse, that I was calling down God's wrath on the house. I'd spend hours in the dark, listening to the thunder, sure that the house would collapse on top of me." Samuel felt rage kindle in his chest, a now familiar feeling whenever Grace shared details of her childhood. He pulled her closer, wrapping a blanket around both of them. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." "I know," Grace said, but she was trembling. "My head knows it, but my body doesn't seem to care." "Then let me help." Samuel shifted so Grace was cradled against his chest, his arms secure around her, his heartbeat steady against her back. "Listen to me, not the storm. Feel my breathing and match it. You're not alone in the dark anymore, Grace. You're here with me, in the warmth and the light, and nothing is going to hurt you." He continued talking, his voice low and soothing, telling her about the first time he'd seen snow as a child, about building snowmen with his sister, about the beauty and power of winter. Gradually, he felt Grace's breathing slow, her muscles uncoil, her body melt into his. "Better?" he asked after a while. "Much better." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "How do you always know exactly what I need?" "I don't always, but I'm learning." Samuel tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "We're learning each other." "I like that," Grace said softly. "Learning each other. It sounds like a journey." "It is, one I plan to take for the rest of my life." They stayed like that for hours, wrapped in blankets and each other while the storm raged outside. They talked about everything, their favorite foods, their biggest regrets, their wildest dreams. Grace admitted she'd always wanted to see the ocean. Samuel confessed he'd once thought about becoming a teacher before the war changed everything. "You'd be a good teacher," Grace said. "You're patient and thorough. You explain things without making people feel stupid." "You think so?" "I know so. You've taught me so much already, not just about ranching, but about who I am, who I can be." Samuel kissed her then, slow and deep, tasting the sweetness of her lips and the coffee they'd shared earlier. Grace responded with equal passion, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body pressing close. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Grace," Samuel said, his voice rough with desire and restraint, "I want you to know that I respect you. I respect your virtue and your choices. But I'm also a man, and you're a beautiful woman. And this, being this close, spending this much time together, it's getting harder to maintain proper boundaries." Grace's eyes were dark in the firelight, pupils dilated. "What if I don't?" "Want you to maintain boundaries," Samuel's pulse jumped. "We're not married yet. I know, but we will be. And Samuel," she cupped his face in her hands, "I trust you completely. You've shown me nothing but respect and kindness. If I choose to be with you before our wedding, it won't be because you pressured me or took advantage. It'll be because I want to, because I love you, because I choose you. Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Samuel searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. He found none, but he also knew that desire could cloud judgment, and he wanted her to be absolutely certain. "Let's wait until after the storm," he said gently. "If you still feel the same way when the sun is shining and we're not trapped together in close quarters, then we'll talk about it again. I want your decision to be completely clear-headed, with no external factors influencing you." Grace looked at him with such love and respect that it nearly undid his resolve. "You're a good man, Samuel Carson. I'm trying to be the man you deserve." On the third day, the storm finally broke. Samuel dug his way to the barn to tend to the animals, and when he returned, he found Grace standing by the window, staring out at a world transformed. The ranch was buried under 4 feet of snow, the landscape an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark shapes of fence posts and trees. The sun was rising, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, making the entire world sparkle as if covered in diamonds. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed. "I've never seen anything so beautiful." Samuel came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Neither have I," he said, but he was looking at her reflection in the window, not at the snow. Grace caught his gaze and smiled. Charmer, truth-teller. They spent the rest of the day digging out, working side by side to clear paths and check on the cattle. The work was exhausting, but there was something satisfying about it too. The physical labor, the clear results, the partnership. That evening, as they sat by the fire nursing sore muscles and cups of hot tea, Grace brought up the conversation from the night before. "I still feel the same way," she said without preamble, "about us, about waiting or not waiting, but I understand why you want to do things properly, and I respect that. So I'll wait, Samuel. But know that when our wedding night comes, I won't be nervous or scared. I'll be ready, because I've been ready since the moment you called my father a fool and looked at my cursed eyes with nothing but admiration." Samuel pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed with love for this brave, stubborn, extraordinary woman. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not." Grace agreed with a grin. "But you're stuck with me anyway." On the third night, as the wind howled outside, Grace came to him with a serious expression. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about why my father's wife really wanted me gone." Samuel set down his book and gave her his full attention. "There was a man," Grace began, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. "The husband of my father's business partner. He was 40-some years old, married, with children, and he became obsessed with me, with my eyes. He said they bewitched him." Samuel's hands clenched, but he kept his voice calm. "What did he do?" "He cornered me several times, tried to kiss me, touch me. I fought him off and told my father, but," she looked away. "My father didn't believe me, said I was trying to cause trouble. His wife believed him, though. She saw how the man looked at me, so she convinced my father to get rid of me." "They threw you out to protect a predator," Samuel said, his voice hard with anger. "They threw me out because it was easier than dealing with the truth." Grace met his eyes. "I wanted you to know before we marry. I wanted you to know that I'm not that I've never—" "I know," Samuel said gently, pulling her into his arms, "and it doesn't matter to me one way or another. What matters is that you're safe now, that no one will ever hurt you like that again." Grace clung to him, and he felt her shoulders shake with silent tears. He held her through it, murmuring reassurances, one hand stroking her hair. "I'm going to be the husband you deserve," he promised. "Patient, kind, respectful. You set the pace for everything, Grace, always." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining with tears and love. "I know. That's why I'm not afraid anymore." As spring approached, the ranch came alive with new growth. Grace planted a vegetable garden 3 times the size of Samuel's previous attempts. She helped with the carving, proving to have a gentle touch with the newborns. She even assisted with breaking some of the young horses, her skill and confidence growing daily. Samuel had never been happier. Every morning he woke up grateful. Every night he went to bed content. The loneliness that had defined his existence for 5 years had been replaced by companionship, laughter, and love. 2 weeks before the wedding, they rode into town to finalize arrangements with the minister. As they walked down Main Street, hand in hand, Samuel noticed people staring. But these stares were different from before. There was curiosity, yes, but also a growing acceptance. Grace had proven herself in these months. She was intelligent, hard-working, and clearly devoted to Samuel. Even the most skeptical townspeople were starting to come around. Morrison approached them outside the general store. Samuel tensed, ready to defend Grace if needed, but the older man's expression was sheepish. "Mr. Carson, Miss Grace," he said, tipping his hat. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior at the auction. It wasn't right, what any of us did that day." Grace inclined her head graciously. "Thank you for saying so, Mr. Morrison." After he walked away, Samuel squeezed her hand. "You handled that well. I've learned from the best," she replied with a smile. The night before the wedding, as tradition dictated, Grace stayed in town with the minister's wife, while Samuel rode back to the ranch alone. The house felt empty without her, and he found himself counting the hours until he could call her his wife. He stood on the porch, looking up at the stars, and thought about the journey that had brought him here. The war, the losses, the years of isolation. And then a single decision to bid on a woman at an auction had changed everything. Tomorrow he would marry her. Tomorrow they would start their life together officially, and he couldn't wait. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the spring air sweet with the scent of wildflowers. Samuel dressed in his best suit, his hands shaking slightly as he tied his tie. He'd faced down enemy soldiers without trembling, but the thought of seeing Grace walk down the aisle made him nervous as a schoolboy. The small church was packed with townspeople, more than Samuel expected. Apparently, their love story had captured hearts throughout Copper Creek. The cursed. A girl and the lonely rancher, finding healing in each other. The music began, and Samuel turned to watch Grace enter. His breath left his body in a rush. She wore a simple white dress that she'd sewn herself, fitted at the waist and flowing to the floor. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, crowned with a wreath of wildflowers. But it was her face that captured him, radiant with joy. Those extraordinary eyes locked on his. She walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away, but she didn't need one. She was giving herself freely, choosing this moment, choosing him. When she reached the altar, Samuel took her hands in his, and the minister began the ceremony. The words washed over him in a blur. All he could focus on was Grace, the way her hands trembled slightly in his, the way her eyes shimmered with happy tears, the way her smile seemed to light up the entire church. "I do," he heard himself say when prompted. "I do," Grace echoed, her voice clear and strong. And then the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Samuel pulled Grace into his arms and kissed her as if she was his air, his water, his very reason for living, because she was. The reception was held at the town hall, the same place where he'd bought her 6 months before. But today, instead of an auction, there was music and dancing and celebration. Grace laughed as Samuel twirled her around the floor, both of them clumsy but happy. "I can't believe we're married," Grace said, breathless from dancing. "Believe it, Mrs. Carson," Samuel replied, loving the way her name sounded with his attached. As the sun began to set, they said their goodbyes and rode back to the ranch together, Grace riding Wildfire beside Samuel's gelding. When they reached home, Samuel dismounted and helped Grace down, then swept her into his arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said, pushing open the door with his shoulder. He set her down gently in the living room, and they stood there for a moment, suddenly shy despite everything. "Are you nervous?" Samuel asked softly. "A little," Grace admitted, "but not afraid. Never afraid with you." Samuel cupped her face in his hands, looking into those mismatched eyes that he'd come to love more than anything. "We have all the time in the world. We don't have to rush anything." "I know," Grace said, rising up to kiss him, "but I don't want to wait. I want to be your wife in every way. I want to start our life together tonight." Samuel kissed her back, slowly and thoroughly, then led her to their bedroom, the room that would now be theirs together. And as the moon rose over the Montana plains, they came together as husband and wife, with tenderness and love and the absolute certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. The months that followed were the happiest of Samuel's life. Grace transformed from bride to true partner, working alongside him on the ranch and bringing joy to every aspect of their daily life. They learned each other's rhythms, fought and made up, laughed and loved with an intensity that sometimes scared Samuel with its strength. Spring came again, painting the Montana landscape in shades of green and gold. Grace planted a massive garden, talking to the plants as if they could hear her. Samuel expanded the cattle herd, his pride growing as he watched their ranch thrive under their combined efforts. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace took Samuel's hand and placed it on her stomach. "Feel that?" she asked, her eyes shining. Samuel felt a tiny flutter beneath his palm, so faint he might have imagined it. But then it came again, a butterfly touch, a whisper of movement. "Is that—" "I'm pregnant," Grace said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We're going to have a baby!" Samuel's vision blurred. He dropped to his knees on the porch, wrapping his arms around Grace's waist, pressing his face against her stomach. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for choosing me, for loving me, for giving me this second chance." Grace ran her fingers through his hair, her own tears falling freely. "We're a family now, Samuel. A real family. We've been a family since the moment you lifted that veil and looked at me with those extraordinary eyes." The pregnancy wasn't easy. Grace suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and Samuel hovered anxiously, bringing her crackers and ginger tea, rubbing her back while she was ill. He read everything he could find about pregnancy and childbirth, determined to be prepared. As Grace's belly swelled with their child, Samuel found himself torn between joy and terror he couldn't shake. The memory of his first wife dying in childbirth, of holding his infant daughter knowing he'd failed to save her mother. What if history repeated itself? What if he lost Grace? He tried to hide his fear, but Grace knew him too well. "Talk to me," she said one night in their 7th month, as they lay in bed together, her back against his chest, his hand resting protectively over her rounded stomach. "I can feel you worrying." "I'm fine." "Liar." She turned in his arms to face him. "Samuel, I know you're scared. I know what happened to your first wife, but I'm strong. And Dr. Morrison in town says I'm healthy. The baby is healthy. Everything is going to be all right. You can't promise that." "No," Grace agreed. "I can't. Life doesn't come with guarantees, but I can promise that I'm fighting for our family with everything I have. And I need you to fight too, not against shadows of the past, but with me for our future." Samuel pulled her closer, careful of her belly. "I don't know how to not be afraid." "Then be afraid, but be here with me anyway. Be present for this miracle we're creating together. I need you, Samuel, not just if everything goes perfectly, but especially if it doesn't." Her words steadied him. Samuel made a conscious choice then, to be present, to be strong, to support Grace through whatever came, rather than borrowing trouble from the past. As winter approached and Grace grew larger, Samuel prepared obsessively. He stocked the house with medical supplies. He made sure Dr. Morrison knew exactly where their ranch was located and had a horse ready at all times. He even convinced Mrs. Henderson, the midwife, to stay with them for the last month of Grace's pregnancy. Grace alternated between amusement and exasperation at his preparations, but she didn't protest. She knew he needed this, needed to feel like he was doing something useful. Their daughter was born on a cold February morning, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected. Samuel had ridden out to check on the cattle when Grace's labor started. Mrs. Henderson sent him away. Pacing husbands are no help to anyone, and Samuel spent the longest hours of his life in the barn, listening to his wife's screams and feeling utterly helpless. When Mrs. Henderson finally came to get him, her face was unreadable, and Samuel's heart stopped. "She's a perfect," Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. "Both of them are. You have a daughter, Mr. Carson." Samuel stumbled into the house, his legs weak with relief. And there was Grace, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with those mismatched eyes, and Samuel felt his world shift once more. "Come meet your daughter," Grace said softly. Samuel approached slowly, almost reverently. Grace pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Dark hair covered her small head, and when she blinked open her eyes, Samuel's breath caught. One blue eye, one green eye, exactly like her mother. Another cursed one, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. But I think she's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. No, Samuel corrected, touching his daughter's tiny face with one gentle finger. Another extraordinary one, like her mother. They named her Sarah Grace, honoring both the daughter Samuel had lost and the woman he'd found. And as Samuel watched Grace nurse their baby, singing softly in the lamplight, he thought about the journey that had brought them here, from an auction platform to this moment, from a cursed girl and a broken man to a family full of love and hope. Sarah Grace latched on with tiny hands, her mismatched eyes drifting closed in contentment. Grace looked up at Samuel and smiled, and in that smile he saw their entire future. Mornings waking up together, evenings on the porch, watching their daughter grow, maybe more children, growing old side by side. "Thank you," he said again, because the words never felt adequate, but they were all he had. "For what?" "For being brave enough to let me buy you, for choosing to stay, for choosing me, for this." He gestured to their daughter, to their home, to the life they'd built together. Grace reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "We chose each other. Remember, and I'd do it again, every single day for the rest of my life." He'd paid $500 for Grace, thinking he was saving her, but the truth was, she'd saved him just as much, maybe more. And every day, when he looked into those mismatched eyes, first his wife's, then his daughter's, he was reminded that what others called cursed was actually blessed, that beauty came in unexpected forms, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Samuel Carson had been a man surviving, just getting through each day. Grace had made him a man living, truly living, with purpose and joy and love. The frontier was still harsh. The work was still hard, the winters were still brutal, but none of that mattered when he came home each evening, to the warmth of his wife's smile and the sound of his daughter's laughter. He'd fallen to his knees the day Grace lifted her veil, not in despair, but in the first stirrings of hope he'd felt in years. And now, years later, he still fell to his knees sometimes, in gratitude, in prayer, in the overwhelming awareness that he'd been given something precious and rare, a second chance at love, at life, at happiness, and this time he would cherish every single moment.